Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands from which our online listeners are joining us today, and pay my respects to their elders. I think we have, several, I think about 60 or so online. So a really well-attended symposium. Research and innovation are seen as engines that drive modern societies, or at least modern economies. Governments invest in research and conceptualize themselves as being in an innovation race. They set priorities and find ways to influence what research gets done. Given their deep influence, research systems and research policies are important objects of research. While quantitative measures such as innovation rankings and citation metrics have some impact on shaping the research agenda and the future priorities and practices, the influence of the social sciences on research systems is less evident, particularly in Australia. The chief scientists call inviting consultation and setting new research priorities that are focused not just on economic gain, but on the well-being of Australians, or Australian well-being, provides an opportunity for us to reflect on how the social sciences and the humanities might inform these discussions. Such conversations are particularly important at this time in history, when ways in which knowledge is produced, consumed, validated, and disseminated are rapidly changing. At the same time, deep inequities within and between nations and the existential threat of climate change are forcing a rethink of traditional ways of conceptualizing well-being itself. This symposium, Research Systems as Research Objects, Histories, Lessons, and Futures, brings together colleagues from across the social sciences and the humanities to reflect on these matters this morning. We will begin with a keynote by James Wilsdon, whom I'll introduce in a moment. James will speak for about 35-40 minutes, after which there'll be time for audience Q&A. If you're joining us online, and I hope everyone online is okay, because I haven't had a chance to check if the online audience is doing well. Okay, so if you're joining us online, please feel free to use the chat function to talk to each other, but please do use the Q&A for any questions you want us to present to the keynote speaker or later on the panel in the panel discussion, because we can't monitor both at the same time. Following the keynote, there'll be 20 minutes for morning tea, and then we return for a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Sujatha. Again, there'll be opportunities for the audience in the room and online to engage in discussion. This will be followed by lunch, which will be served just outside this room. The program today is sponsored by various groups, the Science and Society Network and REDI at Deakin, and Studies, which is a network of STS scholars in education, which is a global network, the UNESCO chair at ANU on science communication for the public good, and the ANU Center for Public Awareness of Science, STEaPP, and at ANU, the Science, Technology and Society Group. At UNSW, we have the Science and Society Network as well. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor James Wilsdon. He's a professor of research policy at University College London. He's director of research on Research Institute, which has a consortium of funders from 15 countries with a combined investment of 25 billion USD a year. It's not to be scoffed at. I had to put that in. James's interdisciplinarity is complemented by his varied experience. Since the late 1990s, he has been a researcher, writer, advisor, and campaigner at the heart of science and research policy in the UK and internationally. In addition to academic posts at the universities of Sheffield, Sussex, and Lancaster, he has worked in think tanks, NGOs, and as Director of Science Policy for the Royal Society, the UK's National Academy of Sciences. In his work, James has advanced concepts such as upstream public engagement, science diplomacy, responsible metrics, and responsible research assessment, and has co-founded or chaired initiatives such as People and Planet, the Campaign for Social Science, the International Network for Government Science and Science Advice, the UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, and he directs, as I said, the Research on Research Institute, RoRI. We're indeed extremely fortunate to have James present the keynote today, in which he will share insights, pose questions, and offer some thought on meta-scientific possibilities of the present moment. A big welcome to you, James.
Thank you, Radhika, very much, and to Sujatha as well for the opportunity to be with you and to take part in what I think will be a really interesting morning's discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should say that the 25 billion that funders are investing is definitely not in the Research on Research Institute, but the amount they invest overall in research. But we'll talk more about meta-scientific investment as we go along. So I'm going to talk really about the field of meta-research, meta-science, sort of how it's changing, particularly interested, I guess, in how it relates and interfaces with STS and related disciplines. I guess I would see myself as coming more out of or still being in STS than any other flavour or brand of so-called meta-research, research on research. But this question of where we situate ourselves, where we fit, how we move and travel around systems of knowledge is something that's very central, I think, to any reflections on meta-science, meta-research. And it was from that really that I kind of lifted the Commons and Borderlands idea for the subtitle of this talk. I'm sure many of you have read this now, nearly 20 years old, I guess. It was 2004 it came out, from Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist, a sort of set of reflections on interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity at a time when that was quite sort of an emerging discussion. And a very short book, but one that I have returned to again and again over 2 decades as a sort of source of reflection and inspiration. So, to business. Why am I doing stuff? Oh, my slide has moved on, but the one on the screen hasn't. Oh, that's the next one. So yes, some people call themselves meta-researchers. Some people are calling themselves meta-scientists. We've got the meta-science series of conferences, which Fiona here and I and others have been involved in. There's also a school of thought that describes itself as science of science, which again is now not coming. Let's just see what's going on with this. I think it's a hardware issue here. Yeah, either those two. Yep. Brilliant, thank you. Good, right, we're in business. Good. Go ahead. No, it's fine. So yes, meta-research, meta-science, science of science, and research on research. I mean, when we set up the research on research, we went for this term research on research for 2 reasons. One, I felt and others agreed that it was more readily understood, I guess. It didn't involve, I mean, I think we in academia, we like words like meta this and meta that, but to sort of wider audiences, it wasn't necessarily the best way to communicate what we were doing. My 8-year-old thinks it's hilarious that his dad, well, he thinks it's hilarious. He thinks it's an ultimate act of sort of pointless solipsism that his father, you do research on your own research, he says with sort of contempt in his voice. Obviously we have other friends from the university, whose children he knows through school, and they research real things like cancer. But his dad does research on research, which gets a lot of amusement. But we went for it partly because at least it was readily understandable by ordinary audiences, by 8-year-olds. I'd say I don't think there's a great amount to put between these different terms. They're all pointing at the same thing. I think more interesting is the question of why have all of these sort of synthetic labels emerged kind of at the same sort of time, albeit from slightly different starting points in the academic system. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. I mean, one answer to the question of why is, as Radhika said in her introduction, that we're investing more in research globally and in countries all over the world than ever before, about $2.4 trillion US in the last year. And R&D expenditure continues to grow. I mean, it bumps up and down depending on wider economic factors, but in general, it's growing and continuing to grow quite steadily. And of course, alongside that, global scientific output is growing even faster. I mean, the actual volume of papers, as we all know from requests to peer review them, continue to just proliferate at an incredible rate. So the system is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, that makes it harder and harder to keep track of that system using normal measures, particularly, where you're sitting in your own discipline, you're looking at the system as a whole. And so you need more synthetic methodologies to try and analyze and navigate through all of this. And then the second big driver is, of course, that we see, in response partly to that growing investment, all sorts of other demands from policymakers, from publics, from the media, from other stakeholders on research systems. imperatives that often compete with one another, but are all being heaped on the science system at the same time. For science to be more directed towards particular challenges or missions, work by Marianne Mazzucato and others, for science to be increasingly collaborative and team science, the whole debate there, example up there. Obviously responding to worries about problems in the scientific system, debates over reproducibility, research integrity, people like Fiona do great work on. And then also questions around incentives and measurement, which I'll say a bit more of it about. I mean, I've been involved in that through things like the metric tide study. So you've got all of these things kind of being layered on the system. And then also, of course, we've got other actors in the system or sort of hovering around the system, sometimes supportively, sometimes a bit parasitically, who are making a lot of money out of tools and methods to better understand these systems. I work with digital science. The reason I'm putting them up, I can be rude about them because they're my friends, but you can't really do meta research without working with one or other of the big commercial data providers. That may change as Open Alex, this new genuinely open citation database, becomes more readily and available. But it has certainly been the case that you basically have to join forces with one or other. And I mean, that's why I work with digital science. So lots of reasons why we see more of this stuff happening. And as I said, I promised a couple of definitions. Here's one at the top from the book, The Science of Science, which presents itself as the first comprehensive overview of the science of science. It describes itself as an emerging interdisciplinary field that relies on big data to unveil the reproducible patterns that govern individual scientific careers and the workings of science. So you can see there's a particular methodological take there that we're getting from Dashan Wang and Barabasi, as I say, coming out of a particular bit of the system. I certainly don't think that definition does justice to the totality of what I would describe as research on research, meta-research. The next one is better. This is from the metrics group at Stanford, so John Ioannidis and others. Meta-research is the study of research itself, its methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives. Meta-research uses an interdisciplinary approach to study, promote, and defend robust science. Interesting definition, particularly that last bit, defend robust science. And I'll end on this as a question as to what is meta-research, what isn't meta-research, how much is meta-research about fixing something that's gone wrong and sort of returning it to its normative state, and how much is it about genuinely interrogating, critiquing, really pulling back the layers of what's going on in research. I would add to Ioannidis' definition all sorts of other things about the politics of science, about the priorities of science, about the broader social relations around science. But still, it's a good start. It was very interesting. So Fiona Fiddler and I were among a couple of hundred people who attended the Metascience 2019 conference, which took place at Stanford and was organised by the Centre for Open Science. And it was a great meeting, really good meeting. It took place, coincidentally, at exactly the same time that the STS community was meeting, I think, in New Orleans for the big 4S meeting, the annual meeting of STS community. And also, that same week in Rome, the Scientometrics community was meeting under their Learned Society, ISTE. So you had running in parallel in 3 different cities around the world, 3 different big events. In fact, Metascience was the smallest of the 3, which all were digging around and looking at aspects of science systems. When the Metascience 2019 conference was advertised, it was presented, at least in the advertising stuff, as a conference about, you can see it there from the subtitle, the emerging field of research on the scientific process. And you see in the blurb there, we've witnessed the emergence of a new discipline called metascience, meta-research on the science of science. This quite understandably provoked a bit of chatter on the interwebs and on Twitter and elsewhere. And there were people pointing out, quite rightly that, well, there's a few of us who've been doing this stuff for a while. And so, it may be new to you, but it isn't necessarily new to the rest of us. And there was a great, I think, in the final platform session at 4S, someone raised this question as to whether we were seeing the Columbusing of STS, the idea of Columbusing, of course, claiming as sort of virgin, undiscovered land, something that, was previously occupied. It was a very relevant concept in Australia. Columbusing STS by discovering the social dimensions of science. And, you know, this, I think, was a really good debate. I should say, in the meeting itself, this wasn't happening. No one was going around saying, I'm from an emerging discipline called meta research. You know, who are you? You know, philosophy of science. It was much more inclusive but, you know, it points to a really important issue, which is about how newer approaches, or different approaches, should we say, relate to other approaches, more established approaches, and you know, what's going on in these kind of claims. Of course, part of what's going on is a claim for resource and a claim for power and a claim for status in, going back to my slides about why, fields which are very, very important, in which there's a lot at stake. We, the Amos group here in Australia and well, now globally, and RoRI became involved in the Metascience conference, and by the time we got to the 2021 meeting, this was the way it was being described, just to show you that things can change for better. There's a long history of research about the scientific process, particularly with fields such as philosophy of science, sociology of science, and STS, contributing unique insights about how science operates. There's also a growing cadre of researchers deploying modern methodologies and big data to investigate the scientific process. Together, these communities of research and stakeholders are the research and development pipeline for improving research practices. Metascience 2021 meetings appointed, convergence, yada, yada. So you see, I mean, this was a direct result, I guess, of us all coming in and joining. And I should say, you know, with enormous encouragement and support from Brian Nozick, etc. I mean, I don't think it was, I think the 2019 stuff was more inadvertent marketing than any sort of deliberate thing. But it was an interesting process. And I think it speaks to broader dynamics that I'll just touch on in the rest of this talk. Fiona and I then chaired a couple of sessions, which you can see online if you're interested, with panels of people who represent the different flavors from the earlier slides I showed, science of science, meta research. And they're quite good as sort of overviews if you're interested in getting into some of the disciplinary sort of semantics, as it were. So they're both up on YouTube. I mean, the Metascience 21 blurb reflects very much the kind of approach that we in RoRI would take. I'm sure that Amos would take, and others. We very much like to sort of see what we're doing as drawing on and being part of a long history. And of course, we could take that history back even further if we wanted, which is very plural, which is very interdisciplinary, and which is continually evolving. I mean, if I had one critique of the sort of STS Columbusing line, it would be, of course, well, if someone had said that to STS in the sort of early 60s or whatever, you know, one could have made the same point from history and philosophy of science, essentially. So I think there is a need on all sides to be a bit more reflexive, which, of course, one would hope the STS community is, about these dynamics and how they play out. But important questions to raise, nonetheless. Very quickly, I'll just touch. We have actually done a study on this, which is coming out very soon as a report and paper, and it's the title of the talk I'm giving, which is I'm sort of previewing some of this with you. We're all meta scientists now. We did a study looking at the bibliometrics around some of this, which of course isn't the total way of analysing it, as per previous points about methodological plurality. But we wanted to understand, just looking at the scientometrics, what these fields were, how they've changed over time, and so we did a bit of number crunching. Or I did with my friends and colleagues at Leiden at CWTS. I won't go through the detail of this, but we looked at a lot of publications, and over the last 10 years, 2010 to 2020, we did the study, so it doesn't come right up to date. One interesting thing, if you look at this just shows you the growth of the fields. I mean, of course, science overall, as per my earlier slide, has been doubling every 9 years, so you'd expect those lines to all be going up. But it is interesting seeing the speed at which some are going up. So the green, very sharp line is scientometrics as a field. This is just literally volume of publications by year. The little yellow at the very bottom there, this is meta research, meta science research. So it's still pretty small, but you have got this very sharp upward tick in the last 5 years, which really corresponds to the opening slides that I was showing you. So quite interesting, and be interesting to keep track of this over the next few years. We then wanted to get into a bit more detail, and so we searched under specific sort of topic headings. Well, this was looking by discipline, and then we looked at these topic headings. So governance of emerging technologies. We tried to kind of pull out, and it's hard to boil these disciplines down into just sort of 12 or 13 search terms, but we tried to pull out some of the biggest topics in those fields. So EDI in the workforce, research funding, research careers, scholarly publishing, open science, research equality, etc. It's not a perfect list, but it was a proxy for what we were trying to do. And then we kind of pulled it around that way. And so, for example, if we take research funding, we found about 4,000 publications in the period. And then we kind of looked at 50 or so of those as a sample to see what was going on. Overall, this is the real interesting slide, and this is where I come back to Marilyn Strathern. This was the result if you layered all of the publications that could be described as meta research, research on research, over a map of the overall system of science, system of knowledge. So you're seeing there the red is social science and some of the humanities. Green, you're coming into life sciences and health research. Blue are the physical sciences, engineering, and then the sort of mauve, purple ones are maths and computer science. You've got life and earth sciences in the kind of greeny yellow. On that map, dots correspond to papers that are in some way or other meta research based on those topics. And of course, you would see, as unsurprisingly, you see these big clumps and clusters in areas that you would expect. So science, technology studies, innovation studies, science metrics is the biggest of those red dots. Social science on reproducibility, so that might be some social psychology, but it could be other social sciences. And then as you come round, you'll see similar kind of clumps, one there on the quality of research. And this is the whole debate 10, 11 years ago now on waste and efficiency in health research, sparked a big literature. I say probably one of those dots is John Ioannidis himself, given he's so prolific, one of the big. But the really interesting thing about this picture isn't the big circles, it's actually all the little dots. Because the big circles are kind of what you would expect. These are disciplines that we know work on this stuff. I mean, it reinforces the point that meta research is a plural and broad field, of course. But the little dots are much more likely to be people who don't self-identify as meta researchers or scientists of science or any such label, but instead are doing research on these questions as a side project alongside their day job, if you like. And more often than not, what they're doing, I mean, if you think of this as a sort of the garden of science, where they're looking out the back window of their own patch of earth, as it were, and they're seeing problems out there that they want to bring data and analysis to try and remedy. That might be problems to do with EDI or you know, who is getting grants, who isn't, how research assessment systems are working, whatever. But they're kind of coming largely intrinsically motivated to try and better understand what's going on, and often then to come up with solutions to how to remedy it. And I think that is an incredibly exciting picture because it shows us the enormous capacity that's out there in research systems to understand, make sense of, and ultimately improve those systems through this kind of distributed collective intelligence. And I think it reflects well, to bring it back to, so I'm not going to talk a lot about Marilyn Strathern, but you know, this, if one thinks of these as, in a sense, the commons and borderlands of meta research, these little dots. I mean, these are the places, they aren't the big central nubs, they're the rugged patches and the you know, bumpy, rocky bits where people you know, are doing their thing and doing lots of interesting stuff. So I think that's a very interesting question. I'll come back to that at the end. I want to speed up. RoRI, as I say, was launched to try and address some of this, and we were launched in 2019, and we ran a pilot phase, which was supposed to go for 2 years, ended up going for 3, thanks to COVID-19. There's an evaluation of it on our website, you can see, and we've published lots of stuff. You can find all of this. This is actually from our Figshare page, which is probably the easiest way to find our publications on our website as well. And then we launched, well, we announced in the middle of last year that we would move into a second phase, which we're now doing. We're about to kind of launch a new set of projects. I suppose what makes RoRI interesting is its structure. We're a consortium of some academics, but then a whole group of research funders. And it's a very sort of co-productive endeavor where we work with the funders to try and both identify the questions that they are grappling with, that they want answering, and but to do so in a kind of collective, collaborative way. So everything's in a sort of, you know, open public interest kind of way, but trying to sort of get funders and others to work, in a sense, to open up more of their data and processes to this kind of collaborative work with meta researchers, researchers on research. I'm going to give 2 quick examples of our work, and then I'm going to end with some stuff on Australia. So we've done a lot of work on experiments by funders, looking at possibilities and actual pilots that are trying to experiment with different ways of awarding grant money and evaluating the effectiveness of different kinds of research investment. Particular interest, of course, in recent years in potential lottery methods or partial randomizations, it's known in more technical circles. Lots of discussion about this, and we were lucky in the RoRI consortium. We actually had 3 or 4 of the funders globally who had been at the forefront of introducing initially quite small-scale pilots of partial randomization. So we've done a lot of work with them and others to try and understand those methods. And there's a nice thing called the Experimental Research Funders Handbook, which you can get on our website, that draws together all of this in one place. But to summarize quickly some of the main things that came out of this work, one was when we got into talking with funders, we realized that there were quite a range of different motivations that lay behind potential pilots of partial randomization. And different funders had different hierarchies of those motivations in terms of why they were doing it. All of the motivations were interesting, but obviously, whether an intervention like partial randomization was judged successful or not would depend, of course, on the weighting you're placing on these different motivations, and they included questions around bias. So for a number of funders, they were concerned that more conventional modes of peer review or panel-based review were introducing various forms of largely implicit bias into selection processes, and so they thought partial randomization could be a way through that. In other cases, it was an attempt to try and reduce bureaucracy and burden, most often on the applicants, sometimes on the funders themselves, in terms of why they were doing it. Lots of interest in, by risk, I mean not the sort of risk of funding, but the desire to fund so-called high-risk, high-reward research. You get these sort of phrases that are bandied around. The sense that peer review processes were too small c conservative, that they would sort of tend to veer towards the mean of a given field, and therefore you were missing the scope to fund more radical breakthrough ideas at the edges in some sense. So that was a big motivator for some. Legitimacy was another concern, not so much to start, but certainly if they began doing it, questions around whether different stakeholders would support the introduction of randomization. So, I mean, applicants, of course, being the most important question here. And one imagines those that got funded through randomization would think it was a great idea. Those that didn't, possibly less so. But of course, all the other stakeholders around it. And I mean, the Health Research Council in New Zealand has done some very good work on this, looking at those different stakeholder groups, because they were also one of the very first funders to do this. And of course, ultimately, as in any research investment, the really important set of questions are around longer term outcomes and impacts. And we can't measure that in any area of research easily. We certainly can't measure it quickly. Normally, you'd want to take at least 15 years. And so we have absolutely no data on that whatsoever from any of these pilots. So, and no one is really doing anything to even try and measure that, which of course is a bit of a problem. So other conclusions on this, I mean, these trials, these pilots, I wouldn't really call them trials because they're not formal trials in that sense, they're sort of pilots. Generally, they were well accepted by the different stakeholders if enough preparation went into communicating what they were for. They were gradually being extended to other schemes, but most of the funders recognized even when they did pilots, they still needed more data in order to draw meaningful conclusions. And other lessons were terminology is important. The word lottery generally sends out the wrong kind of signals, particularly in countries like the UK and Australia, where we see the lottery on the telly, at the weekend or whatever, and people get the wrong idea. So that's why this more technical and dry terminology of partial randomization has come to the fore. Most current initiatives are pilots rather than formal experiments, as I say. I mean, I think going to full RCTs is quite tricky, as I'll say in a minute, but there's definitely more that could be done. And that really is a big conclusion of our handbook, that it's great to see funders being more experimental. I think we would all, and certainly from a meta research perspective, that's something that we want to see more of. At the same time, it's difficult to do this stuff inside funding systems. And it's really important that we try and encourage funders to do it in ways that are more robust, accepting that, you know, there are often challenges doing so. But we need a more ambitious kind of experimental agenda in research funding if we're really to be able to draw harder conclusions from this kind of stuff. At the moment, it's really hard to do that. One of the, well, probably the biggest and most ambitious attempt to trial partial randomization was by the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany, the biggest private foundation in Germany. And they set up in 2017 this experiment initiative you see on the top left of that slide. And I spoke at the wrap-up conference of that 5-year program just before Christmas in Hanover. And, you know, it's produced lots of interesting findings, but I argued to the Volkswagen Foundation that, in a sense, the greatest success of experiment was the example it had given to others to be more experimental. It was actually very hard to draw out solid findings because of all these issues around methodology that I pointed to. And so when you get, you know, Nature and others writing editorials saying the case for lotteries, yes, I mean, to a point, but actually it's still pretty hard to make that case. I think I went into studying lotteries with sort of more optimism about it, and I sort of came out gradually not pessimistic, but certainly with as many, if not more, questions coming out than I had going in. We tried in RoRI to actually put some real detail on this question of, well, you know, you'll hear people saying, well, what we need is a full-blown RCT in research funding, and which is easy said, very hard done. And we try to explain in this working paper quite how difficult that would be. And if one thinks about the unit cost of a research grant, getting, you know, doing a proper trial at sufficient scale to get, you know, findings with sufficient power would be, you know, you're talking 100 million, 150 million. I mean, even with small research grants. So it's really, really hard. And we need to think a bit more creatively in methodological terms, which we tried to do in part 3 with alternatives to RCTs in that paper. I should say that we've so far, even with all the work we do with research funders, not had any funder willing to really go this next, not to an RCT, but to kind of go to the next level of doing something that would be more ambitious. So it shows how far we still need to go. And if you read and listen to people like Michael Nielsen, if you come across him, very interesting thinker in California, has written a lot about open science and is now also writing and doing metascience, albeit in a sort of very Silicon Valley kind of environment. He's really critical of even things like randomization. I mean, he has this, he spoke at the RoRI Phase 2 launch, and this was his sort of diagram designed to show all the possible ways in which we could fund science and research. And his argument basically is that the yellow, visually, I guess, represents what we are doing at the moment. Lotteries sort of sit just on the edge of that. So they are, well, they're actually inside of it, they're just towards the edge of it. But his argument is that there's so many other things we could do, so many other methods we could deploy, we're really not even touching the sides of what we could do. And there's some great, if you want to be provoked and challenged, then I recommend 2 of his papers. This one, The Trouble in Comparing Different Approaches to Science Funding, which I would agree with, having also tried to do it. And more recently, he's done this very interesting paper, very long but interesting paper called A Vision for Metascience, which has some great ideas in it. And he'll be speaking at the Metascience 2023 conference if you want to hear him talk about this. So, research funding, whizzing on quickly, responsible research assessment. This is where I'll try and tie it back to some stuff here in Australia. So I've been involved for a number of years in these debates around metrics and incentives and measurement of research, particularly at the level of national assessment exercises. So like the ERA here or the REF in the UK and various other instruments that we see, certainly not in every country, but in quite a number of countries around the world. And in RoRI, we've been particularly keen, given our consortium and our constituency, to try and focus on what more funders can do as actors in these debates to encourage responsible approaches to research assessment. To take a step back from that, I mean, we've seen in recent years, and this sort of in a sense is parallel to this sort of broader discussion around meta research, but we saw a lot of discussion around 10 years ago now, 10 years ago, around metrics and the limitations of conventional approaches to the use of bibliometrics in assessment. So DORA, of course, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, the Leiden Manifesto, which came out in 2015, Metric Tide, which I did, came out in 2015, various other reports since. But this has gradually moved over the sort of last decade towards this broader set of debates that we're now discussing under the label of responsible research assessment, borrowing in part off debates around responsible research and innovation, which I'm sure some of you work in. And you'll see a few examples there of people doing work on this: Global Research Council, Science Europe, and probably most significantly, just at the top left there again, this agreement on reforming research assessment, which came out from a group of big European institutions in the middle of last year and has now morphed into COARA, this coalition on advancing research assessment, which I think is probably the most interesting and significant global initiative right now in this space. And interestingly, there's no institution as yet in Australia involved in COARA. There's only one university in Australia that's a signatory to DORA, so there's some way to go here in these debates. You are, of course, or we are, given I'm in Australia, involved in discussions around the future of your own assessment system here, and we've got the debate running around ERA and the future of the ARC. I was in Canberra just over a month ago now, it was, I guess, for the Universities Australia annual conference, and we heard Margaret Shield, the Vice-Chancellor of QUT, speaking about her review of the ARC and essentially committing to doing away with the ERA as it has evolved. And of course, she was involved in setting the ERA up, so there's a rather odd, well, I found it a sort of odd prism through which to view research assessment reform, kind of mother killing her pups. But anyway, each to their own. She's going to sort of do away with the ERA. You know, this is a really interesting debate. And of course, the ERA is not I mean, we could have a long debate about things that don't work well in the ERA. But from my perspective, coming at this from debates in Europe and the UK, it's surprising that we're not hearing more, I think, in discussions around ERA and ARC and related reforms here about the positive potential of research assessment in various ways. And I'll say more about that in a second. In the UK, of course, we've also been through various cycles of this. We've been doing it even longer than you have, going back to the mid-80s. And we're going through one of these periodic spasms of reform right now, the Future Research Assessment Programme. There's no particular proposal in the UK to do away with the REF altogether, but there are quite a lot of ideas for quite significant ways in which it could be reformed and improved, and I've been involved in some of that. We published an update to our metric tide review just before Christmas, which kind of looks at where debates over metrics have got to in the last few years, and there's a summary of the recommendations there that I won't go through now because of time. But we've of course seen in research assessment over the past 15 years a lot of dialogue between the UK and Australian systems, and at various points we've borrowed and drawn from frameworks here. I mean, the introduction of impact was, of course, originally, the way we've done it was originally how you were going to do it and then didn't, and then we did it instead and you did it a different way. But this kind of dance, as it were, between, which of course happens in lots of areas of public policy, has been a very visible part of research assessment and research impact debates. And I think that does raise interesting questions then about, sort of, as I say, where the Australian discussion is right now, where it might go, which I'll sort of end on before I stop. In my talk in Canberra, I raised a few kind of questions based on what I'd heard. And I should say I met with Margaret Shield, I met with the ARC and various others to talk to them about this. The first question I asked was really this issue around how you avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater, given things being talked about as a baby. I'll carry on with the baby idea. The baby's being thrown out, but what about the bathwater? How do we reduce bureaucracy and burden from something like the ERA without also losing the progressive possibilities of research assessment? And the debate in Europe really now is increasingly sort of, or certainly in the UK discussion about the REF, the kind of central sort of axis of discussion is between the difference between so-called summative assessment and formative assessment. Summative assessment being the more retrospective sort of audit type of assessment, and formative assessment being how you can use evaluation systems and frameworks to nudge, encourage, shift, shape research systems and cultures in the directions you want them to go in. And of course, I mean, that latter can come with its own bureaucracy, and one needs to be always alert and alive to that. But there's a lot of excitement, and things like COARA as a coalition are very animated by the possibilities of formative assessment. And I, in the discussion about the ERA, at least, I haven't heard a lot of that debate here, although hopefully it will still come. Why does it matter? Well, I think if you shut down a national assessment exercise, and if public institutions, whether that's government or universities or others, vacate that space, the space won't disappear, it will simply be occupied by others. And going back to one of my earlier slides, there are plenty of other actors in research systems who would gladly fill the space of deciding what counts as good in Australian research. And I think one needs to be very alive to those possibilities. I find it weird that there's been a debate, and I know it's a debate that probably most of us in this room would critique vociferously, about the national interest at the level of individual grants. And hopefully that's being watered down a bit from how it was under the previous government. But it's bizarre that you'd even have a discussion about the national interest at the level of an individual grant, and yet surrender any capacity you have as a government, as a national system, to pursue the national interest at a systemic level in your research system. So if not through things like ERA or other instruments, then how does one have a distinctively Australian set of priorities for research? If we vacate the space and we hand it over to Elsevier or the Times Higher or whoever, then you're not going to get that distinctive set of priorities. I wrote a piece with colleague Cameron Naylon, who's based at Curtin University, the other day in Campus Morning Mail about this, which is there if you're interested to read a bit more. And we were we took as our cue another rather harebrained proposal that has, you probably aware of, it's emerged in Western Australia to knock together 4 universities in Western Australia, Curtin, Edith Cowan, Murdoch and UWA, into one sort of mega massive behemoth university, on the basis that it would then rocket up the global rankings. And of course, this is a process that's come from the chief scientist of Western Australia, so I don't quite know what he's been smoking. But it's not how rankings work. I mean, anyone who knows how something like the Times Higher or the QES or Shanghai, how they're put together methodologically, I mean, it won't help. They're volume normalized. Issues are all to do with visibility. I mean, and so as we say in the piece, I mean, there are certain issues, obviously, as to why universities in and around Perth are less visible than universities in and around Melbourne, which you don't need me to tell you because you live here. And you're not going to solve that by knocking them into one institution. So really, really dumb stuff that's being done in the name of rankings that worries me. I was also, when we published that piece, it was brought to my attention that only a few days earlier, our friend Margaret Shield had also appeared in this piece on Elsevier's website that I draw to your attention. Digital Dashboard Tackles Unconscious Bias in Academic Recruitment. This was sort of dressed up as a very progressive thing to sort of help equality, diversity, inclusion. But essentially boils down to a new dashboard of predictive analytics that Margaret has been involved in developing with Elsevier, which would, I guess, potentially be used instead of things like the ERA. I don't know. It's not very clear. It sounds very nice until you get down to the detail of what's being proposed, which is quantitative measures to 30 indicators on 5 stream tabs to tell us about someone's career status, the extent to which they're innovative, the extent to which they're a leader in the field, the extent to which they are multidimensional, and the extent to which they are social and education oriented. Now, I'm an expert in metrics. You can't measure most of that. It's not, I mean, there aren't reliable quantitative proxies for this stuff. So, yeah, it's a bit worrying. Not to mention something of a conflict of interest. But as they say here, I haven't got the piece here, but here we are. Working with someone like Margaret, it's a huge honour. In the article, it goes on to say, Margaret herself says how great it is working with Elsevier. She describes them as a think tank. She says she chose to work with them because there were no academics in Australia who could do anything half as good as this, which again seemed to me deeply offensive to the large and dynamic meta research community, several of whom are in this room. So I just put all this up because I tried to get Campus Morning Mail to write about this, and they wrote a very limp piece. And so while I'm here, I'm going to keep banging this drum to avoid. I sort of can see a future for Australian universities where you're all being managed by the Shield Elsevier Index, which will tell you will take someone at PhD level and predict. Because this is what this stuff. It's predictive analytics. It's like those of you that have read or seen the film, the Michael Lewis baseball stuff. This is what this is. It's kind of looking at the numbers early on in someone's career and drawing lines forward. And I mean, I just don't think you can do that in any responsible way in research. I'm I don't pretend to know enough about baseball to know. Clearly, it did work in the particular case of the team that Michael Lewis wrote about. But it's a really, really, yeah, enough said. My other questions, I'll end. Question number 3. The soft power of shaping research cultures. As I say, Australia has been a very important participant in these debates in the past. And yet right now, we don't really internationally benefit from a strong Australian voice. Of course, individual academics like us in this room are participating in all of this stuff, but institutionally, Australia's voice is somewhat absent. I think that's a shame, and it's to our loss, and I think to your loss too. And it would be great to see more Australian involvement in things like COARA. And then my final question, and I've got 2 slides I'll end on. Going back here to my commons and borderlands, to my diagram of meta research. For me, Margaret Shield shouldn't be looking to Elsevier to come up with the answer to what follows ERA, but instead should be looking to Australia's version of this diagram. There is, again, we have several people here in the room who constitute big and small dots if we were to draw this diagram here in Australia. There's huge expertise in the system, on the system. The challenge for public policy, the challenge for organisations like the ARC or the NHMRC or for government generally, is how to tap into, harness, mobilise that kind of distributed intelligence system. It's there for the taking, and we don't yet see enough moves in that direction by governments and funding agencies in any country, including here. So my end, I wanted to bring it back to, I know we've got lots of STS people here, so I was going to end, I sort of tried to do this with Fiona's group the other day, and it's sort of, I'm not sure people kind of quite got the contrast I was drawing. But going back to my earlier point about, what is and isn't meta-science, think about those 2 definitions we saw. I think a really interesting question when you're coming at this particularly from a more critical social science perspective from STS or elsewhere is, to what extent is the core task of meta-science fixing or correcting things in science that have gone wrong? We'll all be, I'm sure, familiar with Merton's norms for science, which have sparked huge debate in the past 60 years. I won't go through much of that now. But if we think of there being a kind of normative state of sort of robust science, how much is meta-science about kind of doing things that help us get back to that? And how much is it about helping science research to confront, understand, and come to terms with its inherent post-normality? And I'm using post-normality here in the sense of Silvio Funtowitz and Jerry Rivette's, the idea of post-normal science. Because I think meta-science is, by and large, post-normal science in that sense. And I think a large part of the project we're engaged in doing meta-science is, yes, helping to fix science. And I say I don't present these as a binary contrast. I think we're doing both of these things. But if we just do this, or we just pretend we're doing this and don't do a bit of this too, I don't think we're actually serving the longer-term interests of the scientific community and of the societies that science ultimately serves. And I end on my favourite book title. It's not my favourite Steve Shaping book, but a collection of essays that he published a few years ago under this great title of Never Pure: Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture and society and struggling for credibility and authority. And I think that's what we are, we were then, will continue to be. So with that, thank you very much.